Here we are at the entrance to the CATPM hangar. So come on and we'll have a look and see what it is. So as we walk through here, the simplest thing to do is we'll just make a circle of each bay and just discuss what we see. The very first thing we're looking at is a DH-82C, a Canadian-built tiger moth that's actually on loan here from the Royal Museum in Winnipeg while they're building a new home. So it's here out of the wind and weather. As we come down the way here, there's a collection of engines we can look at. The big spar on the wall is a main spar from an Anson aircraft, and you can see the construction of wood, how it was built. And as you come down this way, we come to one of the museum's very first airplanes that we collected. This is an 82A Tiger Moth, a British-built version. And this moth actually served in World War II as a trainer in England. So it's an actual warbird. It was in the theater of war. And it's kind of fun for myself as an aircraft fan to stand here and look at the two Tiger Moths, the British version, the original 82A, and the Canadian, the C version. And you can see has a canopy so that it's operable in cooler weather. There's quite a few differences. The 82A is flight worthy. If it wasn't so windy out and I had one of my pilots who's checked out on it here, we could go for a ride. If you turn around and have a look, this photograph here, I don't know if Mike can get a close-up of the photograph. The airplane behind us that we're looking at, that's the same aircraft. That's the way we acquired it. And it's now in flight-worthy condition. And very nice airplane, fun to fly. The 82C that's next to it, it belongs to our museum, and it's flight worthy. You can come and book a ride in that when we get back to flying after the COVID adventure is over. If you signed up at the beginning of the war, you would learn to fly on perhaps a Fleet Finch or a Tiger Moth, more likely. And from the Tiger Moth, you would graduate into a more advanced aircraft like the Harvard that you can see next. And if you were later in the war, you would have learned on the Cornell. So there's some other interesting aircraft here. The one that says ZE663 on it is an Oster, and it's referred to as an AOP, which is an aerial observer platform, and they were used mostly by the Army to monitor where shells struck the ground. So they would fly the Oster with a pilot, a radio operator, and an observer. Either the Navy or the Army would fire a round off. These guys would observe where it struck, and then radio correction factors in. So it's kind of a neat airplane. As an aircraft mechanic and sometimes pilot, I'd love to fly it. Its minimum flight speed, its stall speed is 30 miles an hour. It's pretty slow. It'd be fun. The Harvard that we have in the museum is the oldest Mark IIA Harvard in the world that still flies. Was built in California in 1940, and at that time America wasn't in the war, so it was flown up to the border at Coots, Montana, and we lassoed it and towed it across the border to put it into service with the RCF. It's one of the very few Harvards that's equipped with armament at all. You notice on the wing there's a 30 cal machine gun sticking out, and not that it would be combative with that, it was just for training, to learn how to aim and shoot a gun in the air. The little tractor that's parked in front of it is an I-14 International, also about in 1938 to 1940. It originally served with the Air Force at McDonald Bombing and Gunnery School north of Portage. And now it's back doing what it was meant to do, tow aircraft around. We use it to move the Harvard. The old Chevy car that's here is the original staff car from this base, and operational as well. You hop in it, put the key in it, and you can drive it anywhere. Back. But big old comfy couch. The aircraft that's got its tail tucked in between the hangar supports is a Mark V Anson. It was built in Winnipeg by McDonnell Brothers to Federal Aircraft Corporation design specs. Of course, handed down from Anson, but there are a lot of Canadian-built Ansons used in the plant. The interesting thing, it's majority of the major construction is wood, and that's why there's so few of them left. They just disintegrate over time. If you zoom in on this photograph, that's the same aircraft. That's the way it arrived here, on a trailer in pieces. Well, there's many other things in the hangar, and perhaps while we're in the hangar, if Mike will just scan around at the rafters and the roof. These hangars were prefabricated at a mill in BC, trucked in here by rail, and assembled on site. There were 701 of them built for the Air Force during the war, and I don't know how many are still standing. Not many. The little tractor here is a 2N. A lot of tractor fanatics will be familiar with 8Ns and 9Ns. The 2N is the 2 represents that it was built in 1942, and the Air Force used them for whatever duties little tractors were required, probably mowing lawns, moving stuff around. The pickup truck is, it says 43 on the sign. I've since found out that's incorrect, or 42. It is a 43, and is an operational truck. And the museum, as you may or may not know, has been closed for a while due to the COVID epidemic, or pandemic. And obviously we need to get in here and dust and clean. But I'm sure that if I went and got the key for that little truck and put it in, it would start right up. We could use it. It's a fun little truck. The aircraft that's beside it is a Hurricane, a Hawker Hurricane, built in Ontario at Port William, Port Arthur, where they had the factory there, Canada Car. And it's interesting why it's here. They had several of them stationed across the prairies during the war to shoot down fire balloons that the Japanese made. The Japanese made big balloons, and of course the air currents across the planet would carry the balloons from Japan to the west coast or wherever of our country. And the idea is, after a certain length of time, the balloon would let out gas, descend, and when it struck the ground, the incendiary bombs on it would start fires. They figured they could set the cities and the forests of North America on fire. And so the Hurricane's job on the prairies and in BC was to see the balloons, be directed to them, and shoot them down and have a controlled fire they could manage. It's kind of interesting. The silver aircraft back there is a Beech 18, commonly referred to as an Expediter. They weren't a training aircraft. They were used to transport the authorities around. The brass would get to come around, and I imagine if you picture that arriving at an airbase, it's probably payday. The truck here with the front axle removed from it's an interesting vehicle. We're in the process of getting it roadworthy again. That truck was originally used to service this airbase between here and downtown, where number 2 Manning Depot was, and it hauled everything, groceries, airmen, anything you can think of. It had to be trucked. They used it. And there's a picture in the window of it here with no explanation, but If you look carefully right here, and you know the terrain of Brandon, we're right alongside the river on First Street. This is the North Hill of Brandon. You can see the old water tower that disappeared a few years ago. There's this truck, and it would be on the way from Manning Depot downtown to the air base with a bunch of new recruit airmen in it coming up here to see what's going on. So it's a neat truck. I appreciate having it. The museum's about so much more than just airplanes. Probably can't really see them right now, but you can see just barely past the nose of that airplane, back in the corner, there's a couple of big snowblower trucks. And they were used to clean the runway and the air base. That odd-looking airplane tucked away in the corner is a fleet fort. There were only a few hundred of them built. The only totally Canadian design in World War II. And we have enough of those in pieces that we can perhaps put one together to flight worthy. We'll see if we get there. The large red truck here, as the sign says, crash tender. It's 6-wheel drive, meant to make its way cross country. It's rough terrain. And the idea would be if an airplane crashed close to the airbase or on the airfield, that truck could get there and hopefully save the pilot and students or whatever happened in the crash. And it will run. It's not fun to drive. It's very rough and a little bit hard to drive. This area is kind of like the Fleet Fort, future projects. And if it probably doesn't look like it to you, but right now standing there looking, there's 3 aircraft here. The one that's closest to it, it's a sign says Cessna Crane. And Cessna Cranes were twin-engine transport trainers, I guess. If you graduated from Taggart, Moss, and Cornell's and were designated to go to Transport or Bomber Command, you'd probably train on an Anson or a Cessna Crane next. The Cessna Crane has the nickname of being the bamboo bomber, and you can see the amount of wood trim that's on it. When it's together, it's a twin-engine aircraft, and I can give you an idea with this display panel here. That's what it would look like if it was assembled. It's an interesting airplane, and we have hopes that perhaps in the next 10 years or so, we'll have it assembled. The large white wing here that's wrapped up in the house wrap, that's the wing for the aircraft, and it's totally restored and airworthy. So it's a matter of getting everything together. This little model aircraft is a model of a Norseman, which is what this is. You'll have to forgive me at the moment, I can't remember. The U.S. Army called it a UC, and I can't remember the last 2 numerical digits. But this aircraft was made in Montreal, went by crate to Britain, and was an air ambulance post-D-Day. Flew wounded soldiers from the European theater war back to Britain. And so it's kind of an interesting airplane. We in the Commonwealth Air Training Plan did use them as buses or air taxis, if you want to call them that, general freight airplane. And we have 2 of them in this pile. You can see the second fuselage back there it's bent as a result of an accident. There's 4 wings. So there is enough here, if we get there with enough support, to put a Norseman together. This unit that you can see, the yellow one, is a fuel tender. The fuel to run all these airplanes would come in on the railway spur line and be pumped into large tanks or unloaded directly from the rail cars into these trucks, and the trucks went out and fueled up the aircraft. And you can see the boom with the fuel nozzle on it. And the boom is designed to swing out over the wing, so you don't drag the hoses over the aircraft, you drop the nozzle down to it. And typically young women in the motor transport pool, those are the gals that drove these. The guys ended up flying the airplanes, the girls did some of the work. So it's a functional truck. I don't know if it's too dark in there to see, Mike. But that's, here, I'll just lift that off there. There's a photocopied picture of what it looked like during the war, and we're kind of getting close to having it back to the way it was. So you notice up in the top, there's that arm is carrying the fuel hose, and you can see the fuel hose out to the wing of the aircraft, which is sort of the idea of how it would have been used. And to me, one of the interesting things about it, the truck was built as a fuel tender at Brown Steel Tank down in Brandon, just off 18th Street by the railway tracks, and Brown Steel's buildings are still there, and there's still a metal shop. So that's kind of fun. The aircraft that it's tied to is a Bolingbroke, and the Bolingbroke is very similar to the British Blenheim, designed in the 30s as a medium-duty bomber and not very effective as a bomber, so a lot of them ended up being used in Canada as twin-engine trainers. And you can see when you look at it, if it's not too bright against the windows, you can see a turret up on top of it. So they would take a gunnery student, a navigator, a pilot, and a second gunnery student, and take them out over, usually over lakes. Bombing and gunnery schools were at places like Mossbank and Defoe in Saskatchewan, McDonald near Lake Manitoba, and Paulson near Lake Dauphin, with the idea that if these were doing practice, target practice, the spent ammunition falls in the lake and not on the civilian population. So they did serve in Europe in the theater of war as Blenheims, but weren't successful, and as a result, they were relegated to training duty here in Canada. As we come along this way, this Jeep, I don't know, anybody who's a Jeep fanatic can recognize that it says in the window, 1959. It's not a wartime Jeep. It belongs to the city of Brandon. It was their airport firefighter for years, and they don't know where to do with it, and we don't either, but it ended up here. When you're looking at the front of the Bolingbroke, you can see the desk in there, with just right up in here, and the stool that the navigator would sit on. He'd be sitting facing the desk, and his job would be to direct the aircraft, navigate it to where you're going. And on that round bracket that you can see through the window is where the bomb sight would mount. So he would be able to direct the bomb run. Kind of an interesting thing. This Anson, you can see, has no wings. They're cut off. And that's typically what happened. Once the war was over, they directed the airmen to go out, cut the wings off them, and scrap them. So a farmer would buy that for maybe $50, put the tail on a wagon, tow it down the country roads home, and make whatever he could out of it. And that's where we found them, just abandoned and derelict on farms. Twin engine trainer, also used for bombing training. As I said, in the Bolingbroke, this is where the mount for the bomb sight would go. And the pedals, you can, if Mike sticks his camera up a little higher, back there you can see the pedals and the control column and levers for the co-pilot. Those can all be folded out of the way, and the bomb aimer can crawl through there, lie on his chest on a pad here, and as Mike moves his camera a bit, this tray slides right up and closes. So there's supposed to be a little plastic dome here, clear. That's closed. So it would be reasonably comfortable. Could you imagine the view laying on your stomach looking out the front. This flips down as a bit of a wind deflector, and you could slide that back to give yourself a better view. So you'd be looking with your bomb sight right out into the clear air at the target you're trying to hit. I think I'd like that ride once on a warm day. Below it is the instrument panel for one of these, and you can see right in this space here where the sign is hanging, that's where you would have space. If the co-pilot controls were removed, you could crawl through there to get to the nose. So just to continue our quick walk around here, this is an interesting device. A flight simulator, a trainer. And during the war, if you wanted to be a really good pilot, you signed up and you went and spent a fair bit of time flying a Link. If you could fly that Link simulator well, you probably could fly a real airplane well. You can crash a Link and walk away from it. You can't crash a real aircraft very well and not damage yourself or the airplane. So the Link was popular. The desk, you can see the green desk has a little device on it referred to as a crab. And on the crab, underneath it would be a map. I'm going to step in here, Mike, so you can see. This little wheel on the front of the crab right here has a little roller on the back which would have ink on it, like blotter ink. And then as you operated the Link trainer, flying it by your controls inside, the crab would crawl around on the map and draw a red line where you went. So there's no way you could argue with your instructor, yeah, I did go there. Well, no, this says you didn't, right? And the other thing that's kind of fun is the operator has a couple of cranks here. One of them is for wind velocity, the other one is for wind direction. He knows the speed you're going, he knows the altitude you're flying at, he knows whether your landing approach is high or low, and he knows your vertical speed, and he'd be able to communicate with you. But when you're in the Link as a student, can you get close enough to have a look in there, Mike, and see the instrument panel and the controls? So once you're in there, you close the door, close the canopy, and now you're flying blind. You have to use your map and your instruments and fly to where you want to go. This little link here is keeping the Link from moving, so I'm going to undo that just momentarily and you'll see the action. With those bellows can allow it to tilt and lean, and if I undid the front lock, it'll tilt in pitch up and down, and it can turn around, so it gives you the sensation of actually flying. It's kind of an interesting device, and with some work I'm sure that this one can be made functional. The aircraft next to us, if you remember, we discussed the Cessna Crane that's a project back there. There's a Cessna Crane with the fabric still on it, but as you notice, it has no wings. They're amputated, cut off, and it wouldn't have a smooth piece of plywood here. It would just be a rough bucksaw axe, cut the wings off them, sell them for scrap. So this one's kind of fun, and most of the time the museum's open. We allow people to go and climb up there, sit in it, and see what it feels like to be in a cockpit. Here, Mike, zoom in on this. I'll get over here, it's better lighting. Oh, some mark on there now. That picture, this picture, is from a Saturday Evening Post advertisement for international trucks during World War II. So you can see there's a couple of Harvards and the fire crew on an international K-8 truck. So there's our museum's Harvard, and there's our fire truck. We didn't have two Harvards to park there, so we parked the Cornell where that one is. And I think we did pretty close. We got the telephone or hydro pole in the same place. So here's about 70 years later than that. And there's the truck, it's still here. And this truck is not functional as a fire truck, but it functions as a driver. We can put a battery in it and start and drive it. Okay, now we're going to go behind the ropes that the public doesn't get. So, when you get canned, I guess today you get fired, right? You're canned. In Air Force terms, those are cans, and they contain components of aircraft, starters, generators, bits and pieces. This engine, I think, is pretty special. It's a 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney Wasp Junior, a 985 cubic inch, so often called a 985. And for those of us that are airplane fans, the de Havilland Beaver was powered by these engines. This engine, when we acquired it, had a tag on it that said serviceable RCF 1960. And it's been in that crate for a long time, but it's a preserved, usable engine. Behind that wood, you can see that's kind of rotten, and a couple of cowlings and a bit of an arch. That's the remains of an Airspeed Oxford, a British design, used as a twin-engine trainer in the plan in Canada. And because of the wood construction, left out in the elements, it's pretty much disappeared. These crates here, maybe you recognize, Mike and I were just showing you that on a different Anson. That's that little window that goes in the bottom of the Anson, and you can see that the wood construction of the airplane has basically disappeared. But this pile and these pieces here are all parts of Anson Mark IIs. And it looks like a pile of junk to the untrained eye perhaps, but if we decide to build an Anson II, this is the raw material. And if Mike turns around a little bit, there's a view of the Mark I Anson. You can kind of see the structure. The pale green structure is the actual steel frame of the airplane, and the wood just gives the fabric the form, gives it the smooth exterior. So, just standing here, you can see there's a group of Kinner engines. There's just having a little bit of a moment here. That's the engine from the Cornell. You can look up in the racks. There's those white racks that are just loaded full of aircraft parts that have been collected over the years. Unfortunately, they aren't all wartime period. Some of that radio pile there that I'm looking at right by that red seat, some of it is post-war stuff, and we have to sort that out and figure out what's what. It's hard to imagine, but a Yale looks just like a Harvard, except its landing gear doesn't retract. There's the main cockpit section of a Yale. We call this portion the bird cage. It's where the rear pilot and the forward pilot would sit. That's the turnover structure, so that in case the airplane ended up on its back, that would carry the weight of the airplane and wouldn't crush the pilots. Mentioned the Cessna Crane. If you notice this pile of stuff, it's all bits and pieces of Cessna Crane. So someday, we do have some interesting engines that are taken apart. That's a 1340 9-cylinder radial engine Cutaway. The 1340 is what powered the Norseman, powered the Harvard, and a few other aircraft as well. And this one was cut apart during the wartime and used for schooling the mechanics. You can see there's a magneto cut apart. There's the carburetor cut apart so you can see inside it. The oil passages, the crankshaft, the timing gears. You can see the whole thing. We've got several of these in various states of disrepair, and my hope is sometime we'll be able to get one to where it would be able to be rotated and watch everything move and understand how a radial engine works. This is the remains of a Cutaway Bristol, which is what powered the Lysanders and Bolingbrookes, a Bristol Hercules. The front nose turret of a Lancaster bomber. The guns here are just wooden dowels made to look like a gun, but that would be right out the very nose position of a Lancaster. I'll let you duck under here, Mike. And I don't know how much contrast you're going to be able to get this with your camera, but we'll just do in and out, and we'll call that a shelving on the floor. This device is an English wheel for bending aluminum into multi-curved, compound curved panels. Kind of an interesting device. And as you can see, if you just scan the racks, there's engines. There's engines for Tiger Moths, and those of you who don't know, you might think that engine's right side up, but actually is upside down. In the Tiger Moths and the Cornells, the engines hang with the cylinders inverted. If you just do a 360, Mike, and it might look like junk to the untrained eye, but it's the raw material for us to restore aircraft. It's lots of fun. Look at all the airplane cylinders, Jacob's engine cylinders. There's more to the automotive motor transport section. This car isn't actually an Air Force car, but it was donated to us, and it's typical of the cars of the time. That's a 1941 Chrysler. It's a pretty nice car. I always make a joke about camouflage, Mike. You wouldn't paint your face white and go try and hide in camouflage, right? So why would you have a Jeep with chrome headlight rings that are going to shine? This isn't a wartime Jeep. It's a 1946 CJ2. And for those of you who may be watching this video, if you happen to know where there's a GP or an MB Jeep, a World War II Jeep that is parts, I gladly trade you if it's equitable value. We would like to have the wartime Jeep rather than the civilian one. One more car over here I think is worthwhile looking, and just while we're talking about restoration, I don't know if Mike can show you with the camera well enough, but this set of wings, if he gets where I am and look down the wings, these wings are just freshly restored, new fabric on them for the Fleet Finch. And as we go through the shop, we'll end up with a little look at the construction of a Fleet Finch. But I wanted to show you one more car before we go away. This is a 1938 Dodge. And I'd like Mike to come and zoom in and look at this group of young men here. You can see this is the same car behind. That gentleman right there is Morgan William George Eaton. And if you notice the age, 22 years, that's the age he was when he passed away. He was killed on a crew in Lancaster in Europe in the war. Morgan bought this car against his mother's wishes in 1939. It's a 1938 Dodge. He and his friends drove the car to Thunder Bay, which was Port Arthur, Fort William back then. World War II broke out while they were there in September of 39, and they decided to join the war. So they went to a recruiting office. They said, no, go home back to Winnipeg. Well, that's quite a trip in this car in those days. You can imagine Thunder Bay to Winnipeg, quite a drive. They got back to Winnipeg, and he signed up, became a bombardier. I think if I read here, he was a bomb aimer. So what we looked at in in the Anson aircraft, laying on your belly and aiming. He was doing that in a Lancaster when their aircraft was hit and the crew was lost. So why is the civilian car here? Because it has a human side to the story that 22 years old, it kind of breaks my heart when you think about how many young people we lost on both sides of the war. What a waste. Anyway, that's a tribute to that generation. If I went and got the key, thing starts and drives beautifully. It's a nice riding car. It's a beautiful car. So we'll take a quick walk through. Can't show the whole hangar at once, but I like the view, just jam full of airplanes. So on a good day, it'd be so noisy in here you wouldn't be able to hear. We've got planers and bandsaws and all kinds of equipment. Look at the size of the teeth on this one. We buy our lumber for making windows for the buildings and other parts as great big square beams of lumber and then resaw them to size with this one. And with the jointers and planers and equipment we have, we can replicate the windows that the museum uses. So if you happen to be a good carpenter and you want to come and work with us, we have the equipment to keep you busy. So if Jeff Bell and I have our way, probably in a couple of months, this is going to fly. Perhaps doesn't look like it, but this is a 1940 Fleet Finch biplane. The wings we looked at in the hangar just there were its lower wings. They mount here. The upper wings would be on interplane struts between it. The engine has been gone through. We know it's airworthy. If Mike goes around the other side and sort of stick his camera up, you can look at the instrument panel and the seats. The aircraft is, everything that's on it has been done to airworthy standards, and we fully intend to have it as an operational aircraft. It should be quite a toy. So when the war broke out, the Air Force had 27 of these. They were the primary trainer when the war started. So we're quite excited to have the privilege of restoring it and make it into something that the public can enjoy for years and years to come. So, what else can I say except I really enjoy working here and I'm glad Mike's joined us. And please come visit. Thanks for being with us on this tour.